It's just after midnight in South Africa. It's election day in America.
I will stop the invasion of criminals coming across our border. I will strengthen our military. I will restore peace in the world.
I am ready to offer that leadership as the next president of the United States of America.
Good morning to you, South Africa, and those watching around the world. My name is Blain Herman. You're watching a special coverage of the U.S. elections on multiple platforms, the SABC News channel as well as SABC2. Already, millions of votes have been cast for the 47th president of the United States. Look, saying it's a tight race is an understatement, right? As reflected in national and state polls in the build-up to today. Consequential. Why? Well, the U.S. is one of South Africa's most valued trading partners, so what happens there tends to matter. At the SAUS Interactive Business Forum in September, President Cyril Ramaphosa said that cooperation with America is aligned to South Africa's national priorities, and it extends to people-to-people cooperation in what? Spheres of education, culture, tourism, and institution building. A number of U.S. companies operate in South Africa, and also, last year, the United States was the second largest destination for South Africa's exports. So this morning, this question hangs over the Republic. What impact will the U.S. elections have on South Africa? We have the better minds on the program this morning, strategically positioned to explore some of your answers to this question in greater detail. Shaun Bryce-Pease in New York, Mitch McCann in Michigan, Sophie Mokoena here with me in studio, Kailishle Kumalo at the Magic Wall. We also want you to share your thoughts with us. We're opening up the lines. The number is 011-714-0677, 7879, 011-714-0677, 7879. I want to hear from you. Give us a call. I know you're up, interested in these elections. So what do you say? Let's get to it. All right, let's get straight to it. Let me bring in SABC News correspondent Mitch McCann, live for us at the Battleground States of Michigan. Mitch, good to see you. Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin seen as key. Why?
Well, good morning to you in South Africa. Good evening from here in the battleground state of Michigan, where the polls are incredibly close, and they're also close in those other battleground states you mentioned. Here in Michigan, the New York Times has national polling with Kamala Harris ahead of Donald Trump, but by less than 1%, illustrating just how close it is, and it's been like that for some time now. We've seen a steady stream of voters here in Michigan today. We spent the day in Dearborn, Michigan, just outside Detroit, and really we saw how divided the voters were. I spoke to a man who said he was voting for Donald Trump. There was no way he was voting for Kamala Harris. He described her as a puppet if she was to become the president of the United States. It was only 45 seconds later, I spoke to two parents with a young child. They were going in to vote. They said there was no way they were voting for Donald Trump. They were voting for Kamala Harris. So it's fair to say it is very divided here. It's going to be very interesting to see which way it goes tonight. Of course, Joe Biden won this state in 2020 by around 150,000 votes. Donald Trump won it in 2016 by only around 11,000 votes. He managed to flip the state red for the first time since 1988. It remains to be seen if he can do that again here tonight.
I wonder, Mitch, has the ground game from both candidates worked? Are you seeing people coming out en masse to vote?
Big time. A huge amount of votes from here in Michigan. And to give you an indication, 3.3 million people in the state voted before Election Day. That is 45% of the entire number of registered voters in the state. That is a huge amount of early votes. And to your first point about the ground game, there has been a big ground game for both candidates who have spent a lot of time in this state. Kamala Harris was here yesterday. We watched her leave her hotel. She was staying near us. Tim Walz, her running mate, was in town last night in downtown Detroit. And Donald Trump was here in Michigan last night too, having his final rally in Grand Rapids. Rapids. It's also the same place he had his final rally of his 2016 campaign and his 2020 campaign. It really illustrates just how seriously these candidates are taking Michigan, because really it is a big prize. 15 electoral votes. It's only shy of North Carolina on 16 and Pennsylvania on 19. So if they can win Michigan tonight, that goes a long way to winning towards the White House.
Mitch, those that have come out to vote today, what's top of mind? What are the issues that are driving people to the polls?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of significant issues people are considering here in Michigan. We've talked to people who have been concerned about the automotive industry. You know, Michigan is known for a few things: Motown, Madonna, and the Mustang. Cars here are very important. It's really what put Michigan on the map around 100 years ago. It's where the headquarters of Ford is, General Motors and Chrysler. But that industry has been significantly diminished in the last 30 years for a variety of reasons, including the global financial crisis. Donald Trump says he can return to greatness that industry. So a lot of people are looking towards Donald Trump for that. He says he's going to end what he calls electric vehicle mandates. There's also another major issue in this state, and that's the war in Gaza. And where we were today in Dearborn, that's the first Arab majority city in the United States. A lot of people in that city are unhappy with the Biden administration's stance on the war in Gaza. There are 200,000 registered voters in this state who identify as Arab American. They might have a big say in determining who wins this entire election, not just Michigan.
Are you getting a sense that that is indeed the case? Is it making a material difference in the way people vote?
Look, I think the war in Gaza is making a material difference, and I'll give you one example why that is. Earlier this year, in the Democratic primary, Joe Biden was running, of course, in this state. 100,000 people voted or wrote in uncommitted instead of ticking Joe Biden's name, and that was as a protest vote. Now, 100,000 people is a significant amount when you consider he only won this state by 154,000 votes in 2020. So that Arab American vote could have a huge difference at the end of the day here. But there are also some people that are going for a third-party candidate like Jill Stein, because they don't like what Harris is doing when it comes to the war in Gaza, and they are too worried about what Trump's going to do. So there is a third-party option there. But either way, I think the Arab American vote could really have a huge impact on this result.
Look, we've seen Donald Trump out and about. He did speak after he voted, but basically wrapping up his campaign in Michigan. Big takeaways from his last pitch to voters?
Yeah, look, the last day of campaigning for both candidates was huge. From memory, Kamala Harris had about 5 events. Donald Trump had 4. As I said, he finished here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, really pushing to voters to come out. He actually didn't arrive until around midnight. That was scheduled for 10:30 p.m. He didn't get back on his plane to Florida until 2:30 in the morning, again illustrating how serious they're taking this state. Donald Trump really pushing, I think, based on what he's been saying at the rallies and the TV ads here, a theme of fear. I think it is fair to say. Fear that Kamala Harris is going to ruin the economy. He says the Democrats have already done that. And he's also pointed out that there are a number of wars around the world that are set to continue or worsen if the Democrats run. That's what Donald Trump has had to say. So I think it's fair to say he has been running on a theme of fear. And just on that point, it's important for our international viewers to note the television ads and the commercials here online, on TV, and on cell phones are absolutely relentless. I haven't seen anything like this in any other part of the world. It's hard to avoid watching television without being flooded with these commercials at the moment. So they've taken it really serious in Michigan, both at the rallies and on television.
Mitch, appreciate your input on this. We'll catch up with you a little later on. SABC News correspondent Mitch McCann live for us in the battleground state of Michigan. Let's head over to New York. SABC News correspondent Sharon Bryce-Bees is live for us. They're Sharon, good to see you. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? All right, it seems that we can't hear Sharon at this stage. We will come back to him in a short while. It is important to understand what's happening in New York. Remember, Donald Trump, born in New York, really made his name in New York. Does his message still resonate in New York? We'll find out from Sharon Bryce-Pease in a few moments. But there's lots to discuss in terms of this elections. You heard Mitch talk about already mail-in votes. Nationally, there's about 82 million pre-election votes. Khayelitsha Khumalo is the man of the moment, the man in front of the magic wall, as we call it. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, it's important elections, right? Why? Two candidates, historic. Either way, you're going to get some sort of history here, right? Why? Kamala Harris could be the first woman president in the United States. Donald Trump could be the first president since Grover Cleveland, I think it is, 1800s, to be voted out and then voted back in. Historic indeed.
Well, very much so, Blaine. A very pivotal moment for the U.S. I mean, for example, you look at Kamala Harris. I mean, all the way from California with a legal background. She has always really just credited herself for being with the downtrodden, really just given her background, coming from the middle-class family. And that has been a very key message that she has been preaching all along, but also becoming the vice president, the new for the U.S., for the female, especially a woman of color. So a very important time for them. But also, when you look at Donald Trump, I mean, this is not the first time he's making a shot at the White House. Right. He's been there. He knows the mechanics, and we really know what he stands for. America First really became the mantra that he really used. And going back to Harris, the issue around protection of so many rights, whether you're looking at human rights, whether you're looking at the gay rights, and many other issues as well. Harris has come in, just at the end of July, right? Taking over after Joe Biden backed off, basically flying the plane and building it at the same time, right? What sort of impact has she made in that short space of time? It was incredible because literally she had to save the Democrats coming in the midst of the state of confusion after Joe Biden pulled out of the race. Really, she had to crisscross all the states in the U.S., convince the Americans that she has what it takes to really occupy that office, the Oval Office. But also just apart from that, the messaging for her, it's been just about the very common issues around fighting inflation, as we know that cost of living crisis is a big issue in the U.S. Yeah, something that Donald Trump has been stumping on as well, economy and immigration. Now, he was impeached twice, right? But obviously acquitted by the Senate twice. Does that make any difference in the minds of his supporters, his base? Doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like that at all, Blaine, especially because those are really passionate supporters of Trump. They really see him as a savior of America. I mean, for example, he talks often about the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who's saying the world was better under Trump. So we're seeing all these myriad of global challenges where he really spoke about a lot of experiences that the world encountered. Obviously, those who really know things, they do say, I mean, it's a bit of a long shot to make such remarks. All right, let's have a look at this. Now, this is very interesting. I'm glad I have your better mind on this because the Electoral college system is a bit of a complicated system. But in general, there's over 500 electors, and the magic number that they need to aim for is 270. You've got 30 seconds. Explain. Well, absolutely, Blaine. Look, it's a fairly complex system because you have these electors coming from these states. So this is a very old tradition for America where the popular vote, it does matter, but it really boils down to the Electoral College because they really have this massive say representing these states. So they say it's all about making sure that the small states are not disadvantaged by the system. But I mean, it's a very, very contentious system. You go back to the time of Hillary Clinton, she won the popular vote. But when you look at the Electoral College, that's where the challenge came. So it remains a very, very controversial system. Al Gore was the other that won the popular vote. As we know, that George W. Bush ended up winning. So controversial in some quarters. But let's talk about this very important slide. The swing states, 7 of them. The focus largely on Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Now, pundits are saying, you win Pennsylvania, you win Michigan, you win Wisconsin, 10, 15, 19, clear shot to the White House.
and that 270. What's your take?
Well, that's absolutely true, especially given really all these dynamics in the U.S. Blain, Pennsylvania, obviously, that's where you have this chunk of in terms of the votes, but also in terms of Michigan as well.
Yeah.
But obviously, there are a lot of factors that are really driving the voters. I mean, for example, somebody who's right in Arizona will be so concerned about the issue of immigration. I mean, when you talk about the border politics, they're fairly close to Mexico.
Right.
When you listen to Donald Trump's messaging, it's been around the issue of saying, look, the Democrats have not done so well in stamping and dealing with the tide of the migrants who are flocking to the U.S.
Yeah.
But obviously, for others as well, you look at Michigan, for example, you have a very significant number of the Arab Americans. So they're very concerned about the current situation in the Middle East. So they feel that the Democrats really could have done better in terms of making sure that there's long-lasting peace, but also in terms of how the U.S. has been backing Israel. So they're not really seeing the impact or the role for the U.S. to be a peacemaker here.
You've been out and about talking to experts as well. What's the sentiment on the ground with regards to some of the rhetoric coming from Kamala Harris, coming from Donald Trump?
I think it's very clear that they do understand of the role that the U.S. can play in terms of whether you're looking at global trade, whether you're looking at partnership with South Africa, lots of outstanding issues, whether you're looking at AGOA, for example, whether you're looking at Power Africa, that initiative to try and electrify the African continent. So you have all those dynamics, but also the cultural issues as well, where they see the affinities with South Africa. For example, the civil rights movement, they played a very incredible role in terms of fighting against apartheid. So there's always that similarities that they always draw upon, but also just in terms of democracy, South Africa has always been seen as that country where we've seen successive elections. So a lot of them, they also see these places as their home as well.
Both countries have had their fair share in terms of dealing with racial inequalities for the longest of time, still grappling in many cases with that. I wonder what people are saying here in South Africa about, do we see America as a friend or just a strategic ally in terms of trade?
I think it's a bit of both, Blain. For example, when you look at issues around this trade preferential treatment between the U.S. and a number of sub-Saharan countries, including South Africa. So there's quite a lot to be learned. But also for the U.S., they do understand the geopolitical environment, that you cannot ignore the African continent. This is where you do have the young population, but also when you talk about, for example, fighting terrorism in the Sahel, making sure that the Horn of Africa is stable, but also they do know of, for example, this rivalry between China and the U.S. One of the very critical issues when these candidates are talking about foreign policy, the whole issue about de-risking China, about really just understanding that America should do a lot in terms of catching up, in terms of really just having a footprint in Africa.
Value added, no doubt, sir. I hope you can stick around. We're going to talk more about the swing states. Also, we have our reporters, as I said, strategically positioned in those swing states. Very important indeed. What's the viable, the plausible path for both Trump as well as Kamala Harris to 270 to head to the White House? We will find out. Quick break. More next. Welcome back. You're watching SABC News, a special coverage of the U.S. elections. Full swing. Some polls have closed. Something in the United States that they do that we don't do here in South Africa is exit polls. We're going to reach out to our reporters there, get a sense of how people are voting. What are they saying when they're leaving the polling? It's for these two. Historic, no doubt. Kamala Harris could be the first woman president. Donald Trump could be the first president since Grover Cleveland back in 1800s to be voted out and voted in. Who can do it? But we are looking at it through the lens of South Africa, through the lens of Africa. What would either of these two candidates in the White House mean for you and your family? Is there a fundamental difference that they will make? Obviously, they will be hyper-focused in terms of national issues. The latter part in terms of policy might come, operative word. But we will see and we will test it and we'll give you more context. Now, what about the voices on the ground. These New York residents have differing thoughts about the elections. This is what they had to say. Take a look.
Economy, border, and having someone in charge that can deal with any situation in the world.
And who's that person?
Donald Trump?
Security, economy, morally responsible. I need people that are morally responsible, and that's pretty much it.
So who did you vote for?
It's secret, isn't it?
Basically maintaining a constitutional democracy and some stability and continuity in the country. I think that's the most important thing. It's actually not a terribly difficult choice if you think about it. Voting for a convicted felon and con man and, verified liar versus somebody that's been in public service for 30, 40 years.
So what then do you make of all the support that he does attract?
Beats me.
Character, democracy, freedom, equality, justice, and the economy, and then all the details that fall underneath that, and I just want us to be human with each other.
Which means you voted for?
What do you think?
Tell me.
I voted for Harris, big time.
The most important issues are for you in this election?
Oh, not having Trump come back.
How did you lean?
Kamala. I don't think I could morally vote for Trump.
I think there's a couple of things. The economy is one, but also I think that we need to sort of make America, like have Americans here and kind of be careful about the borders so that we make sure we're safe.
So you voted for?
Trump.
You voted today? What were the important issues?
What were the important issues? Immigration is probably number one, and the economy, obviously. Unity of the American people was a big one. What else?
And so where does that make you land in terms of presidential candidate?
I think that Donald Trump is bringing the country back together, and I think that the Democrats have bastardized the immigration in this country, and it's time to close the border.
We voted for Kamala. We're very proud to say we voted for Kamala. I have a daughter, and I think it's important for our future.
What is it about Donald Trump that puts you off?
I think he's really hateful, and I think he represents something very divisive in this country.
I voted for Kamala. I think the issues most important to me were access to abortion, women's rights. I'd say those were the crowning issues. But in general, I think I'm just looking for a little bit more civility in politics. I think there are a lot of people who are looking for a return to that.
Show and Bryce Peace for those vox pops, as we call it in the business, but voice of the people, very important. Sophie Mokoena is with me this morning, SABC News International Editor. Good to have you on the program, Sophie. We've got the presidents. The presidents will be coming here from Bill Clinton all the way to Joe Biden. Bill Clinton, we've got George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and then we have Joe Biden. So, from 93, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. Well, can Kamala Harris buck the trend, or can Donald Trump continue? Big question, right?
Yes, indeed, a big question. And we have seen in the past years that at times, there are times where you see that kind of an upset. I mean, 2016, when people thought that Hillary Clinton would be the president, but, Donald Trump became the president. And that speaks to, you can't really predict. And these leaders were different in terms of their execution of their responsibilities. And when you look particularly in relation to their relationship with Africa and South Africa in particular, with Bill Clinton, it was nice. Madiba's friends, even post his presidency, he continued to be a friend of South Africa, a friend of Madiba. W. Bush, perhaps there were problems, but not problems. The relationship that he had with former President Thabo Mbeki was quite strong. And Bush could confide in former President Thabo Mbeki, tell him issues that are complex in nature that cannot be resolved. One of those is the Middle East. That's what Thabo Mbeki tells me. And then you go to Barack Obama. It was nice, Black American, the whole Africa celebrating, but the war in Iraq.
Right.
When he left office, he was not so popular on the continent. And then you have Donald Trump, a businessman, and people knew that for him it was going to be a business. And those people who are captains of industries and the people who are running the economy of the world. But there was so much confusion, particularly on the global stage.
I wonder, for very little is going to be spoken about this man, Joe Biden. I wonder what sort of, let's just maybe touch on it now while we get a chance. What sort of legacy does he leave? It left in a very untidy way, one would say, right? Giving Kamala like around 100 days or so until the elections. What sort of legacy do you think he leaves behind?
I think people must give Joe Biden credit. Longest serving member of Senate. And he's a shrewd politician from early age, and sometimes talking about apartheid when he was in the Senate. Who can forget that powerful statement or the speech he delivered in the Senate around apartheid? But secondly, when Barack Obama was elected, he didn't shy away from agreeing to assist Barack Obama, and he was quite senior in terms of politics and the politics of America, and he did agree. Now, at this juncture, when it was clear that, truth be told, age was not on his side, again agreeing to step aside, even reluctantly so, but he did do that, and quickly endorsing the person whom they thought can fight this race at that short space of time. Much as perhaps he is aggrieved where he is, but he did become a real statesman by agreeing to step aside and to support a woman for that matter.
Well, speaking about that, I want to talk about the man in the middle, Barack Obama. When he was president, there was a lot of expectation, especially from Africa, you know, given the fact that he has roots in Africa, in Kenya. I wonder, a two-part question, I wonder how he navigated through that, and now him being used as a surrogate for Kamala Harris, is he useful in that regard?
Yes, indeed, it is useful in a sense that you are trying to prove a point that even minorities, when you look at the demographics of the United States of America, they are also Americans and they deserve to be given a chance. And therefore, I think that's what people are saying. But the candidate didn't want to use that. She wants to be inclusive and she wants to appeal to everyone. And she hasn't been that forthright in terms of using that advantage. And many people are saying perhaps she should have done that. But other people are saying she wanted to be seen as someone who is going to embrace all the Americans. So as a presidential candidate, as a leader, at times you may take certain decisions. They may help you to be a leader that is accepted and you win the race. Sometimes some decisions can work against your ambitions.
Barack Obama took over from George W. Bush. George W. Bush's vice, Dick Cheney, interesting. In the news, why? Staunch Republican, but reportedly voting for Kamala Harris. So is his daughter, Liz Cheney. Talk to us about the shift from staunch Republicans moving over to Democrats.
I think some of the Republicans have reservations in terms of who Donald Trump is. You know, his populist statements and the decisions that he took when he was in office, but who Donald Trump is. And therefore we saw some Republicans, not only that family, many Republicans, some of them are women who are saying because of their reproductive rights would rather go with Kamala Harris. So there has been some members of the Republicans that are not happy about the candidate. They didn't make noise, but clearly they are not. I mean, you look at Bush, he's still alive. We didn't see him campaigning and publicly endorsing Trump, much as he is a Republican. And you saw him most of the time in the states events. He's there interacting with the former presidents, those who are from the Democrats, and it looks like there's a good relationship. So there are those issues, but including the Democrats. There are Democrats who have decided they will go with the Republicans.
Look, if Donald Trump wins, it'll be a moot point, but if he doesn't, I wonder if the Republican Party will finally start re-looking at its association with him.
That's the problem. Many people are saying, you don't have a party, you have an individual. And that's the problem, where you see a situation where a leader becomes a party. And therefore, no one can call him to order or do anything. And I think now they are hoping that if he does get in, this is the last term. He has pointed out earlier on that if he doesn't get it, that's the end. He's not going to come back. And at least the Republicans can start looking at where to from here and try and correct what transpired when Donald Trump literally hijacked the party.
You know, you mentioned something very interesting a little earlier with regards to women and the way they're going to vote now. Roe versus Wade talks to the issue of abortion rights as well, that was dropped. And when you hear women talking, that seems to be right on top in terms of their lists of priorities, in terms of their rights to their own bodies. How much of support do you think Kamala Harris will get from women in the United States?
That issue is so sensitive, and not only in America, around the world. And you have countries where women are scared to come out publicly to push for that, and they will do it quietly. So in America, you'll find women who are not talking, but they are going to speak at the ballot, because some women feel very strong about that. And therefore, those who feel strong about that, clearly, they are going to vote for Kamala Harris. And that is why when you look at the behavior of certain women, when they are going to the polling stations, they don't even want to talk to the media. Because here it's about what counts to them, and it's about life and death.
It kind of breaks down in terms of college and non-college voters, women voters, the education divide. It's going to talk to these two candidates there. If, Llewellyn, you can put up the Electoral College graphic and we can talk about that. It's, as we said, it's a complicated system. You need to get to 270. In terms of the swing states, that's very important as well. And another point on the women is that I heard reporting is that women make up the majority of voters in those swing states. So Kamala Harris really needs to kind of get that. If you see, I guess, more women in the line, it's maybe a telltale sign that it might go there. But when are we likely to get some results on these boards in terms of electoral support?
Well, when you look at those swing states, such as Georgia, as soon as we get the results from that state, it will be an indication where this thing is going.
Right.
And therefore, I think very soon you will see Georgia posting its results. And I think the opinion polls will soon come up in terms of where this thing is going, because you still have polling stations in other areas because of the time difference in the United States of America, where people are still in the queues. I saw earlier on that when you look at Pennsylvania, you have lots of people who are still waiting to get into the voting stations, and particularly the college and the university students. And it looks like these are young people, and they may also contribute towards where this thing is going.
Donald Trump is in Florida. He'll have his watch party, so to speak, there. Kamala Harris is in D.C., Washington, D.C. Will be going to alma mater at the end of the night or whenever we reach a conclusion. But lots of people, including former presidents, backing Kamala Harris. One such is former Botswana president backing Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris to occupy the White House. Exclusively speaking to the SABC News, Kama has expressed his happiness with the U.S. elections development.
I have been following. It's very difficult, really, not to follow because it's been on the main news channels, you know, for days, weeks, and months now. And my view is that really there's no choice. It can only be Kamala Harris who is the only fit person to lead that country. Donald Trump is a total disaster. He's a racist. He is a dictator. He's everything you can think under the sun. The worst kind of person you would ever want to lead a country. And the fact that he has got so much support, and we are talking about, they say the polls are 50-50. It's just unbelievable that there could be people who could follow a man like that. So for the good of America and for good for the international community, I hope that he is rejected like he was the last time.
All right, live visuals from various places in the United States. We've got New Hampshire in the United States. We've got Pennsylvania. What do you know about Pennsylvania? Key state, a swing state, a battleground. Lots of votes up for grabs. As you saw, a lot of attention being focused by both candidates, Kamala Harris as well as Donald Trump. Stumping there, you saw them earlier on, I think it was on Monday, holding their final rallies there. Sophie, what do we understand in terms of the dynamics in these swing states? Who's leading, who's not? Is it neck and neck?
It is almost neck and neck. You have a situation where you find that one candidate has got an edge, but a very narrow edge. But you see the challenge here with polls, the prediction can be the way they are, right, and only to find that everybody is off the mark. There's hope that the margin won't be as bad as it often happens with some of these predictions. I mean, look at Botswana. We didn't know that the governing party will today have only 4 seats in parliament. And therefore, it is very, early to tell. But I think when North Carolina and Georgia declare, you will then begin to be able to interpret what's likely going to happen in these swing states. And the state like Michigan, we spoke about the dynamics there, that normally the Democrats will be sitting comfortably. But because of the issue of the Middle East, now there is a problem there. And that is why we have our colleague there to monitor what's going to happen in Michigan.
All right. We've got a number of guests that we have. We've got Advocate Sipho Mantula from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. We've also got Dr. Philani Mthembu, who's the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and Dr. Ditlari Rabele, who is a politics and elections expert. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. Maybe if I can start with you, Advocate Mantula, with regards to what you've seen and the dynamics that's playing out. Obviously, we're trying to look at this from a South African point of view, from an African point of view. Who is your candidate to further the cause of Africa?
Morning, Blain, and good evening to our viewers wherever they are in the continent. Blain, I think it's very important for us not to look at which candidate will be best for the continent. Looking at that, when you look at their foreign policy towards Africa, it has been legit.
Advocate, I think we've got a terrible echo. We'll try to fix it and come back to you in a short while. So stand by, we'll get you there. Dr. Mthembu, if you can hear me, I hope that you can. Same question to you. In terms of who's your pick that can kind of make a difference in the national priorities that South Africa has and also the priorities in Africa in general?
Well, I think the lesson that we've learned, especially from the period after President Obama, is that it is not necessarily about saying which candidate will be best for Africa. I think the key priority is how the continent positions itself in terms of engaging with the United States. We know that both with Republicans and with Democrats, Africa has not been a top priority in recent years. And the key is how African states, both as individuals but also collectively, can actually strategize better in terms of proactively engaging the United States to ensure that their priorities align with the continent's own development priorities.
Dr. Mthembu, I'll just pause the conversation with you there. It seems like the gremlins are hard at work this morning. We're going to try to fix the sound. Sophie Mokoena is still with me. We're going to get you a global perspective, but through the lens of South Africa and Africa. It's important to understand this relationship that South Africa has with America and, you know, basically what it means for you, your family, the industries you work in. It's going to be an important conversation. We're with you past 2 o'clock, so stay with us. Quick break, more next. Welcome back. Our special coverage of the U.S. elections continues. We're looking at various angles in and around America. As you can see, people still voting. In some, their voting has closed or closing. Remember, it's different time zones, so different polling stations close at different times. So it complicates it a bit, but we have our eyes and ears on the ground. Our correspondents there, we're going to get the very latest. Remember, we're focusing on swing states as well. Important ones. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. The pundits or commentators seem to think that if you grab all those three, that's a surefire way or a telltale sign that you're heading to the White House. Let's bring in SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce live for us in New York. Sherwin, good to see you. What are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Well, let me just paint a picture for you, right? So you talk about polls beginning to close. That'll be on the East Coast, sort of the New England area of the United States. But the big poll that we are waiting to close is in the states of North Carolina at around 7:30 p.m. my time, which is in about an hour and a half's time, Blain, and the state of Georgia, which will be at around 7 p.m. our time, which is in exactly an hour's time. And why are those two states of particular interest to this discussion? They are because they are one of the earliest swing states that will be closing polls and beginning tabulation. And what's that going to do for us? It's going to give us the first indication of how the swing states are trending. What we know about traditional Republican strongholds is that they will likely go for Donald Trump. What we know about traditional Democratic strongholds like the state of New York, where I am broadcasting from, it's likely to go for Kamala Harris. What we don't know is which way Georgia is going to go. We don't know which way North Carolina is going to go. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona. And that's where the game is at. That is the focus. Why? Because both candidates need to get to 270 electoral college votes. The traditional strongholds only get them so far, and 270 is where the keys are hanging for access to the White House and the Oval Office in particular. So Georgia's going to give us a real indication of where we go tonight. North Carolina might add to that, but based on the polling right now, we simply don't know how those states are going to go. I also have the first exit polls, Blain. CBS News has just released one of the first exit polls. Let me give you a run through of what CBS News' exit poll is saying. The economy, right? It's the economy, stupid, to quote Jim Carville, Bill Clinton's former special advisor during the 1992 election that he won against George H.W. Bush. It's the economy, stupid. The exit poll shows the economy is the top issue for all voters. Immigration, followed by democracy, and abortion not really up in the top three. So that'll be of a little concern to Harris supporters, Harris voters in particular. 7 out of 10, 70% of voters expect violence related to the presidential result. 70%, what a number. 70% of Harris voters are scared that if Trump is elected, as opposed to 58% of Trump voters who are scared if Harris is elected. Trump voters on the question of whether this election will be conducted fairly, 47% of Trump voters say they are confident it will be. 52%, a majority of Trump voters say they are not confident the election will be conducted fairly. Harris voters, a complete difference. 88% are confident that the election will be free and fair and conducted fairly. 11% are confident. And this is borne out of what the two nominees have been saying. Donald Trump has been casting aspersions about the election without basis, without substance. Kamala Harris has been very clear that she would accept the outcome of the election and had confidence in America's election integrity, be that as it may, governed in 50 states by 50 different laws under the purview of the secretaries of state across the secretaries of state in each state. So certainly emblematic of how Harris supporters are emulating their principal and how Trump supporters are emulating him. And here's the last one for you. 7 out of 10 are unhappy with how things are going in the country. So how that translates into the issues that are of greatest pertinence to individual voters remains to be seen. But certainly a snapshot kind of the mood and the sentiment here that is really directing voters to the polls. But we still have a long way to go here. Polls are only going to close. The latest polls will close in Hawaii and in Alaska at around 7 and 8 a.m. South African time tomorrow, your morning, today. In South Africa. So a bit to go here still, Blain.
Yeah, 100%. Sherman, look, those two issues that you mentioned at the top in terms of economy, in terms of immigration, talks to how hard Donald Trump was stumping in terms of those issues, right? But I wonder, the latter part that you spoke about and the sense that you're getting, is there a lot of anxiety from the people that you're speaking to around these elections? What happens if Trump wins, but also what happens if he loses? Could there be another, for instance, January 6th type event? Is that on people's minds?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the anxiety and the suspense is driven by a fear. Certainly, if you're a Trump supporter, if you're a Harris supporter, first of all, you're scared that the other person is going to win. Sure. Because the elections are not just about policy. It's not just about issues. There is an emotional connection and an attachment associated with polling, and that's why there are sometimes tears. There's, people get sick when election results come in. Just ask Hillary supporters in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Sophie Mokoena was with me in Times Square when we saw people literally crying on the streets, and one imagines that there will be at least 50% of this country in tears were their nominee or their candidate not to win here. So yes, there is a fear simply from losing. But the violence we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election based on Donald Trump's lies, essentially, right? I mean, Donald Trump's own attorney general at the time, a guy called Bill Barr, said to him, there's no substance. Your top law enforcement official tells you there's no substance to your claims of fraud, and you just ignore him and you hire Rudy Giuliani to represent you. And he's been disbarred now. So the courts have withstood the attacks on the credibility of the election. They have looked at the evidence and they have found the claims not to be credible. So, the judicial system stood up here. Law enforcement stood up. The big concern is here, it seems to matter not how Donald Trump really, riled up his supporters in terms of the attack on the U.S. Capitol we saw on January 6th, and how that matters not today. They don't care about that. They don't care that he's been indicted to several federal indictments. He has a case to answer in the state of Georgia. He's been convicted on 34 counts of fraud in the state of New York, where in relation to the 2016 hush money payments to a porn star named Stormy Daniels. And he's due to be sentenced later this month on those charges. But were he to win this, right, those things will likely go away. He's already said he will fire the special counsel. And Justice Department rules say you cannot indict, or you certainly cannot pursue a sitting president in the courts of law here. So this election is not just about the issue. It's also very personal for Donald Trump, because it could mean the difference of him having to go to court or the difference of him having to go to jail. Right.
Let me bring in Sophie on that and the difference between a South African electorate and a United States electorate. The fact and feel factor, whether you're voting on policy or whether you think that the person you're voting for is good for you. How's that difference in terms of your observation?
There is no difference. You have the same issue here in South Africa, where at times people are voting because of a particular individual. And also the issue of populism. It's one issue that always dominates the elections in South Africa. And therefore, much as on issues, perhaps you may have different issues, based on the different developments of the state in which the countries are. For example, the United States of America is the third largest economy in the world, and therefore you have different issues in terms of lifestyle, access to resources, and all of that. But generally, the personality cult is there in South Africa. People will follow a leader, irrespective of all the challenges. I often talk about a moment comparing South Africa with a US moment, South Africa, US having a South Africa moment, because we've had such incidents where people were just attached to a leader irrespective of whatever happens, whoever says what, we follow the leader.
Right.
It's there, that culture.
Personality politics cuts through nations, cuts through societies, and I also read something very interesting on Politico the other day, and saying that U.S. stocks have been on a tear with the bellwether S&P 500 index climbing, more than 10% since August. And I guess the S&P 500's performance in the run-up to Election Day has historically been a strong indicator of whether the incumbent party's candidate will retain control of the White House, correctly forecasting, I'm told, all but 4 presidential races over the last 96 years or so. I wonder if voters or forecasters are putting any stock into that. Mind the pun.
The economy is humming in the United States. The third quarter growth in the USA was around 2.8%. The Dow Jones and the S&P, as you mentioned, have reached records under the Biden administration. The difference, though, is that the cost of living has not come down as fast as inflation has come down in the United States. Inflation had hit above 8% soon after the COVID-19 pandemic, where supply chains were disrupted. And so bringing back the global economy has had a huge impact on inflation, not only in the United States, but also around the world. United States also printed a lot of money and gave a lot of money to citizens to bridge the gaps they were feeling in terms of their economic welfare as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what is true about this economy is that inflation is down to around 2.1%. The Fed goal, the Reserve Bank in the United States goal, is 2%, so pretty much where they want it. Inflation, the interest rates have started to come down. Another interest rate cut is expected this week. Wages across the board are up. But what people are still feeling is the price of milk is too expensive. Right? Eggs cost more than they did 3 years ago. And so whether you're doing well in terms of, your wages and that sort of thing, you're still paying more for eggs, and you're paying more for fuel. And that irritates even people that do have expendable income in that regard. So that's the challenge facing the Biden administration here, is how do you bring down the cost of living, the cost of housing, the cost of groceries that is representative of the state of the economy, right? Because the economy is doing well. There are people getting very wealthy in the stock market, right? Their 401ks, which is the retirement plans for a lot of people in the United States, are doing very well in this economy. The question really becomes a pertinent one at that, is how do we bring the cost of living, the day-to-day expenses down? And that's the difficulty that Donald Trump has honed in on. He's promising writ large to lower inflation. He's going to, droll, baby, droll. And so he speaks very plainly about the issues that are facing people, and that resonates. Call it populism or not. Yeah. Donald Trump is a very plain-spoken individual, and that tends to resonate with a lot of people here.
What about his talk, or reported talk, of increasing tariffs, in particular in China, but generally around the world, about 20% around the world? How would that affect a country like South Africa?
Well, it's, tariffs are a burden borne by consumers, right? So if you impose a tariff, it's essentially a tax on your citizens. And so this is a message that has been spelt out to Donald Trump by Nobel laureate economists that are backing Kamala Harris's economic plan here. But, it's very difficult to convince Donald Trump that is wrong, and he certainly isn't one to admit such things. So tariffs, of course, a big concern, but he's adamant that this is what he's going to do. They have very different economic visions for the country. Donald Trump believes in tax cuts for everybody, including the wealthiest Americans, and the Biden administration believes the wealthiest Americans need to pay more because so as to help the middle class here. So it's a complicated question. One doesn't really know how, placing tariffs on imports from everywhere around the world, how that's going to grow the U.S. economy and how that will influence the global economy here. So certainly a lot of question marks as to how this plays itself out. I can tell you that Republicans in Donald Trump's own party don't like his talk about imposing tariffs on everything.
Right. Still lots to talk about. Sean, stand by. I need to take a quick break. We've got Sophie Mokwena here as well, SABC News International Editor. We're going to look at this elections from a holistic point of view. What are the commonalities, though, between South Africa and the United States? And how can we improve that relationship, especially in terms of trade? More next. Welcome back. You're watching our special coverage of the United States elections. We're heading closer to polls closing throughout various time zones across the country. And as they vote, we here in South Africa are also asking what sort of impact will that vote have on us here in South Africa, but also Africa at large. Now, we've asked you that question. You sent us your voice notes. Let's take a listen.
South African economic peace and security foreign policy will determine the relations between South Africa and America. Post-elections should Kamala Harris take the lead. However, Donald Trump has proven that he's too radical towards African states.
I think America this time needs a woman president for a change. Donald Trump was once a president of the United States, and looking at his age as well, he must just rest, and he doesn't care about Africans.
Regarding the U.S. elections, I think the best way is for Donald Trump to win those elections because the guy has a vision and has many solutions for many problems.
My views on the United States elections, I pray that Kamala Harris comes in. We all know what Trump is all about. So, yeah, we can't have another Putin there.
I'm looking at the elections in America, looking at Ms. Kamala, Democrat, open-minded somebody, looking at the reproductive rights of women, looking at the foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, that there's peace there, and the two-state solution. Mr. Trump, is much more concerned about the domestic reform agenda. He is a conservative, want to protect his country and his citizens. Immigration laws, he wants only people with specialized skills and expertise in America. If you don't have, forget.
U.S. election is a joke, it's a comedy show. It's non-competitive because both parties stand for the same thing. That's why they like using outside rhetoric to avoid the issues, because when it comes to the issues, they are both saying the same thing.
All right, we appreciate your thoughts. Split down the middle, as you can expect. It's kind of polarizing this elections, not only here in South Africa, but around the world. Let's bring in Sean Bryce live for us in New York. Sean, reporting earlier on about bomb threats in certain areas. What's the FBI saying?
I'll tell you that in a second. Let me just give you the breaking news. The state of Kentucky and the state of Indiana have closed polls. So we expect, certainly within a few, maybe an hour or more, the first results from the states on the east coast of the United States. These are Republican-leaning states. Mitch McConnell, the current Republican majority leader in the Senate, is the senior senator from Kentucky. That is a very Republican state, although it has a Democratic governor. Federal office holders tend to be Republican, and they tend to vote for the Republican presidential nominee, and that is expected to be no different in this election. So Donald Trump likely to pick up the states of Kentucky, Indiana, just to get us going, just to get the engine called the Electoral College going. So those two, the first states, Blain, I can confirm, have now closed, and we expect results from them shortly. The FBI putting out a statement in relation to bomb threats at various polling stations in the state of Georgia, one of those key swing states, right? And I'll just read you very briefly what the FBI statement says. The FBI is aware of bomb threats to polling locations in several states, many of which appear to originate from Russian email domains. None of the threats have been determined to be credible thus far. Election integrity is among the FBI's highest priorities, and we will continue to work closely with state and local law enforcement partners to respond to any threat. So certainly some concern initially, but it certainly appears to be a hoax. We saw the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia, Raffensperger, speaking a little bit earlier as it relates to this, and he made a quip that Russia was targeting the wrong Georgia. They should be targeting the country of Georgia, which is one of their neighbors.
Well, let me bring in Sophie on this. And again, you know, Russia's name is mentioned, geopolitics at play here, South Africa's BRICS partner. I wonder what's behind all of this. Is it credible? Is it not? Still up in the air. But how does that affect geopolitics when you hear a country's name in association with another country's elections?
This will fuel tension between the United States of America and that particular country, because we know that there has been a serious tension in terms of how these countries interact. Particularly the war in Ukraine has kind of pushed the two countries far apart. And therefore, when you have these allegations or these reports and these investigations, then you are beginning to remind people about the hostility and also the tension between the two countries. And therefore, we know that even before elections, there were unconfirmed reports that America is saying that they expect perhaps interference with the elections.
Right.
And we are used to these reports, and they often happen and when you have a big country going to elections.
Right. Sharon, you're clearing your throat. You've probably got something important to say. Let me tempt you with the issue of the relationship between South Africa and America. What's the feeling back home, in your home there of New York? Is it a sound relationship? Is it a friendly relationship? Or is it a strategic partnership based on trade?
Maybe the relationship was the frog in my throat, Blain, right? You know, there's been some tension between Pretoria and Washington as it relates to South Africa's foreign policy. The House of Representatives earlier this year, I think around May, while South Africa was having its election, passed legislation called the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Review Act, right? And at the heart of that legislation are questions certain lawmakers in Congress would like the Biden administration, or whatever administration is in power, to really review South Africa's strategic relationship with the United States because they view South Africa's foreign policy positions as antithetical to the interests, the foreign policy interests of the United States, what they call the U.S. national security concerns, right? And so the Lady R debacle, South Africa's neutrality as it relates to the war in Ukraine, the posture from the Ramaphosa government, particularly most recently at the BRICS summit in Russia. This was picked up by the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who tweeted complaining as to why the Biden administration wasn't taking a closer look at reviewing the relationship with South Africa. So what does that tell us about the outcome of this election? Were Republicans to control the House of Representatives? Were they to take control of the Senate? And were they to be in charge of the White House? One can expect that legislation to be reviewed, taken up again in the new Congress, because there's certainly a position within the Republican caucus that is unhappy with some of the positions South Africa has taken. Right, right now, Chuck Schumer, the Democrat senior senator from New York, is in charge of the Senate. They haven't taken up the House legislation. And of course, the White House indicating, I believe, to South Africa's diplomats that they were not certainly they didn't have an appetite to take up that legislation. But were Donald Trump to come into power, one wonders what his transactional position in how he conducts business, right? It's a very he likes transactional relationships. what's in this for me if I do this for you? I mean, just ask some of the NATO members about how concerned they are about what another Trump term would mean for that alliance. And so one should be very skeptical of what the future would look like under the Trump administration. What will the U.S. benefit from that relation? South Africa certainly argues that this is a two-way street. There are 600 companies from the United States invested in South Africa, and the benefits go both ways. So they are certainly confident. I spoke to Park Stow, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, when he accompanied President Ramaphosa to the UN General Assembly in September, and he said that he believed South Africa had made the case for its continued inclusion in AGOA. The other thing I would mention is how the United States has, under the Biden administration, has dealt with questions about AGOA. And you look no further than the country of Uganda, right? The East African country of Uganda that passed legislation, draconian legislation as it relates to LGBTQI people. This was an affront to the United States. And so human rights has been a very central theme as in how the Biden administration I wouldn't say writ large, right, because there's the Gaza example, but has sought to conduct itself. And so one wonders if Uganda's position as it relates to LGBTQI would be as much of a problem for Donald Trump as it has been for the Biden administration. We suspect it would not.
Sophie, I wonder if there's going to be any fundamental shifts in terms of whether Trump comes back in or Harris takes over. And we forget that the White House is not the only thing up for grabs, right? It's control of the House, and the Senate Republicans hold majority in the House, the Democrats of the Senate, but it's very slim margin. Do you expect any fundamental policy shift as it relates to South Africa?
I don't think so. We saw when it was Bush, there wasn't much, even though you had Bush as a Republican. It did happen with Donald Trump, not much. Those threats were there, the fears were there, but it didn't happen. We still have PEPFAR, we still have AGOA. The same with President Joe Biden. Right. It continued, and we know that he has actually supported the extension of AGOA, but you know that that's in the hands of the congressmen and women and to approve. And therefore, if there's a shift in relation to the House, then you'll have a problem. Perhaps you'll have people who look at South Africa, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine, and also the situation in the Middle East. And therefore, I think, Shawan, you were there when the president met Joe Biden in Washington, trying to iron out the differences. And I think it did help, because later we saw some interaction and perhaps taking a more milder position. But with the war now, or the conflict in the Middle East, you know where America stands, particularly in relation to President Joe Biden. And I think, Shawan, one other issue, I think the South Africa hosting of the G20 next year, in terms of these two leaders, who is likely going to make it down south?
Yeah. You think Donald Trump is going to come to South Africa next year, Shawan, if he's president?
Well, I don't believe he made a trip during his first term to Africa. I think Melania Trump, the First Lady, visited Egypt and maybe Ghana, and I think she was the only representative of the White House to make it down to Africa. I think Mike Pompeo did visit the continent, the former Secretary of State. Look, whoever wins this election will likely go to South Africa next year. And one wonders what if it were to be Donald Trump, right, one wonders what the America First disposition, that is very much the central theme of his campaign, what that would mean for multilateral fora like the G20, what that would mean for multilateral fora at the United Nations. What we do know about South Africa is that they believe in the central role of organizations like the United Nations, the centrality of organizations in a sub-regional context like the African Union, like SADC. And South Africa is very engaged and very involved in those discussions, because there's a recognition that in terms of the global economy, which is the purview of the G20, in terms of pandemic responsiveness, which is the purview of the World Health Organization, the response to international peace and security, which is the purview of the United Nations and the Security Council in particular, you need the engagement of some of the powerful countries in the world, the most powerful being among them the United States of America. And so if you have an America first ideology which says we will look internally, we will put tariffs on everybody. Donald Trump, what does history teach us, Blain?
Yeah.
Donald Trump removed the United States from the Human Rights Council in Geneva. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. He withdrew the United States, the hard-fought negotiation under the auspices of Barack Obama and the former leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the agreement known as the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. He withdrew from that as well. And so there seems to be no qualms in a Trump administration of undercutting the centrality of multilateralism, and one wonders what that might look like in a second term. It certainly doesn't bode well for institutions like the United Nations, where Republicans in the Congress are already very skeptical of the United Nations. You can see how the rhetoric around Israel's relationship with the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. And funding is a very big issue right now for the United Nations, and the US is still one of the biggest funders of the organization. And what does that look like under a new Republican Donald Trump administration? Lots of questions.
I wonder, Sherwin, will the MAGA movement last beyond Donald Trump? Even if he doesn't become president, the Make America Great Again. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Donald Trump, whether he's president or not, will still have a bullhorn. He still has legions of supporters. He might not run for president again, right? That's what he says. But even that could change. Maybe Donald Trump, if he loses, will run again when he's 82. So we simply don't know that. Donald Trump, can say one thing and mean another, and that's something we've certainly learned over the times. But who will be the next? Who will carry the mantle forward? Who will be the standard bearer of MAGA? Will it be a J.D. Vance? Will it be a Marjorie Taylor Greene? There are certainly mini Trumps in Congress, people that emulate him, people that emulate his rhetoric. A lot of Republicans have learned, just if you say something many, many times, maybe someone will believe you. And that's a political lesson that Donald Trump has taught a lot of Republicans, and it's evidenced in this election. So yes, the MAGA movement is not going anywhere. The question really becomes, do the Liz Cheneys of the Republican Party, do the Kissinger, I'm forgetting some of the names now, but do those middle-of-the-road Republicans, your Cheneys, some of the Republicans that served on the January 6th committee, do those, Mitt Romney, the senator of Utah, do they leave the party? Do they create an offshoot of the Republican Party? Is this Republican Party representative of old school GOP Republican values?
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be the case. So the question really becomes, do we see a split in the Republican Party? And how does that undermine this long-standing two-party system, which is very central to American democracy, which now seems to be undercut by the popularity of Donald Trump within that party? So, yeah, MAGA will continue. The question is, who's going to be the face of MAGA moving forward? We don't know.
Diplomatic protocol, Sophie, would suggest that South Africa doesn't come out and say, I would like a Harris or I'd like a Trump. But what's the talk behind the scenes, if you will, or your sources are saying? Which would South Africa prefer, the Grand Old Party or the Democrats?
Well, South Africa doesn't have a stance, but they will have to work with whoever is in power. I mean, it will be silly of South Africa to be really forthright and tell us journalists who they prefer, because they wouldn't want the same to happen to South Africa. But as I pointed out, the reality is an American president will always be an American president. And countries that have relationship with America will have to find a way and navigate the fact that an American president will always have that interest in terms of ensuring that America comes first. But you would then be diplomatic to ensure that you have a good relationship with a country that you think you can invest in. And we know that America will have to work with South Africa. How many American companies do we have in South Africa? Many, many companies. At the multilateral level, I think Sherwin is also better placed, particularly when you look at the United Nations, as we pointed out, the G20, and other issues. America does communicate with South Africa, because South Africa on the continent is a country that is very strategic in the in this continent, and therefore you would want to have a cordial relationship with South Africa, be it trade or political, because it is a country that can also assist you in terms of achieving certain goals, particularly in relation to trade and investment.
I know I need to take a break, but Sherwin, I just want to throw this to you to button up this conversation. South Africa's non-aligned stance, do you think it engenders more and more skepticism from countries like the United States towards South Africa?
So there was an investment conference a couple of weeks ago run by the big banks in New York City. The finance minister, the deputy finance minister was here. The Minister of Electricity and Energy was here. The Reserve Bank governor was here. And a lot of people from Washington that were in the room. And I was having a conversation with someone who was saying that the relationship between the United States and South Africa is certainly not where it needs to be. And there is still some questions within the governing administration about how South Africa is dealing with its foreign policy as it relates to the United States, right? And I think you both in studio know who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about. And so there is certainly an unhappiness, and that I think is evidenced in the legislation that the Republican Party passed. It's kind of targeting South Africa. I haven't seen legislation to review the China bilateral relationship with the United States. I haven't seen them reviewing the Brazilian or the Indian relationship with the United States. So South Africa, and given Prime Minister Modi's relationship with Russia, one could almost argue that it's not very much different from that of President Ramaphosa's with Vladimir Putin. So why the targeting of South Africa? But I must also add that the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Ronald Lamola, who was in Washington, D.C. in September, spoke very plainly about how, we should respect each other, we should work together, but we should certainly not dictate to each other what each other's foreign policy should be. This should be a mutually beneficial relationship that is born out of and based on respect. And that was a very plain-speaking Ronald Lamola. How that landed in the United States, I'm not sure of. But the legislation hasn't gone forward in the Senate. The question is who takes control of the chambers of Congress after this election, and who will be in the White House, and how will that inform how we move forward in the relationship? South Africa will certainly be hoping that it will be continue to be a mutually beneficial one. And they are certainly working very, very, very hard to ensure that they remain within one of the parties to the African Growth and Opportunities Act. But let me also add this. South Africa hasn't had a permanent ambassador in Washington, D.C. for a very long time.
Right.
And the previous permanent ambassador was not perhaps as effective as one might have hoped. So South Africa needs to get its ducks in a row and appoint an ambassador, because that sends a message to the administration about how important this relationship is.
All right, we need to take a quick break. Show and stand by. Sophie Mokoena still in studio. We're going to try and get you some latest results as well. Our election coverage, United States elections, continues after this. Welcome back. Our special coverage of the U.S. elections continues on SABC News and SABC2. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And another person that's been staying up with us is Dr. Philani Mthembu, the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue. Doctor, thank you for your time. I know we've been having some technical issues, but we appreciate your time and your better mind on this matter. Two options so far. Donald Trump, former president, current vice president, Kamala Harris. Who's your pick? Why is it good for South Africa? Why is it good for Africa?
Well, I think what's important is to manage our expectations. We've learned that from the administration of President Obama and subsequent administrations. So it's not in our interest to necessarily look at who is favorable for us, because the reality is that whether it's President Trump or Harris, their main mandate will be to take forward the U.S. national interest. What I think is important for us is to have a multi-pronged strategy that looks all at the executive branch of the U.S. government, but that also actively engages Congress in the U.S. Many of our challenges in the last 4 years have not emanated in terms of our relationship with the executive branch of the U.S. government, but they've emanated because of misunderstandings at the legislative branch. And so we've seen certain policy reviews that have emanated from Congress. So what is important is that South Africa has a proactive engagement with the U.S. on multiple levels, because the reality is that Africa will not be a top priority. However, the U.S. does need Africa. It needs Africa in terms of accessing rare minerals. It needs Africa in terms of the number of votes within the UN Security Council. And so Africa will play a role, but we need to temper our expectations in a sense that we are not a core interest for the U.S. And so that is how I think South Africa needs to approach whoever wins this election.
Right. Look, there's various factors that could influence this election, could influence voters. One of the issues is the Middle East and the situation in Gaza. How do you see that playing out and swaying the electorate in America?
It has definitely had a negative impact for Kamala Harris. She is closely associated, obviously, with the Biden administration. And I think the general feel, especially amongst Arab voters in the U.S., is that the U.S. has essentially lost control and is complicit in the ongoing genocide within Gaza. And that is certainly going to have a negative impact for Kamala Harris. So if anything, that might play towards the advantage of Trump.
I wonder, in terms of Donald Trump and some of the foreign leaders, former, expressing some apprehension if there is a second bite at the cherry in terms of Donald Trump. Is there a way for countries who have these concerns, be it current, to Trump-proof, if you will, their foreign policies?
Well, the challenge, I mean, let's look at the close allies of the United States, traditional allies. It's no secret that the vast majority of leaders within Europe would prefer Harris to win. In fact, they've made statements that might come back to bite them should President Trump win. And so I think it's quite important to understand that, yes, whilst Trump as an individual might put many people off at a personal level, it's important to understand that relations are between states, ultimately. And so, you know, the close partners of the United States, should Trump win, they should have learned from his first administration that at times he is obviously quite an impulsive leader, but at the same time that there are mechanisms within the U.S. Political system which are able to somehow keep him in check. So he will use his presidential powers. But the reality is that the U.S. is quite a polarized society. It is quite polarized within Congress and the House of Representatives. So there are certain limitations that President Trump, even President Trump, will have to face and might then have to resort to executive orders using his presidential power. And so it's important to understand that relations are not only between individuals. You might have a very good personal relationship with a head of state, but the national interests may not necessarily align. And so it's quite important in that regard, you know, for close partners of the United States to learn how to manage a potential Trump administration.
Right. Sherwin, let me bring you in to the conversation. South Africa's talking about relationships, the good doctor touched on. South Africa's enthusiasm, one would say, to partner with countries like Russia, with China, with Iran, under the BRICS umbrella. How I guess the basic aim is to create this multipolar world. I wonder how's it viewed in the United States?
Oh, certainly not positively, and I refer you back to that social media post by the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. Essentially, if the Republicans take control of the Senate, this would be the individual who would chair the Foreign Relations Committee, and he was raising questions about the chumminess that was on display at the BRICS summit between various heads of state, no less the chumminess we saw on display between President Ramaphosa and President Vladimir Putin. President Vladimir Putin is indicted, is an indictee of the International Criminal Court, even though the United States is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, but they do cooperate with the ICC. Those pictures, those images certainly did not land very well in the United States. But also, just to add to the professor's point earlier about how the United States will need Africa and a relationship with Africa, particularly as in this hunt and chase for minerals that will really fuel the green transition that everybody around the world is responsible for. All countries are engaged in this transition to renewable energy. I would just argue and make the point that Africa is not a monolith, right? The continental free trade area notwithstanding, we can see how African countries split on a lot of issues, be that LGBTQI, be that the relationship in terms of Western Sahara and the independence sought by the Sahrawi. We see how Africa splits on those issues. We've seen Africa split on the Middle East question. And so you could almost imagine a Donald Trump, the transactional nature of a Trump presidency would seek to create divisions in that relationship, right? So can Africa agree on everything? That's a question that the Africans will have to answer. But it's certainly the case that you do not have broad consensus in how Africa as a collective would approach any issue necessarily.
Sophie, is there broad consensus in South Africa of whether there's commonality in an SA-US interests as well as values? What's the sentiment?
Well, I think South Africa would want to continue to have a good relationship with the United States of America, much as every country would want to defend its autonomy. But South Africa would want to continue to have a good relationship with the United States of America. And that is why, no matter how difficult it can be, there will always be a decision taken perhaps to send people to go and speak to the United States of America. They do the same. You have people coming to South Africa, sometimes we don't even know, who are here to engage with the politicians. I'm talking about government. And therefore, that's the nature of diplomacy. You fight, but you have to find a way to mend the relations, because the reality is when you look at the current challenges we are facing around the world, and the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, always talk about no country is an island. And therefore, you must continue to try and reach out and resolve those challenges when you have them.
Dr. Mthembu, with a multipolar world, with the formation of BRICS Plus now, I wonder to what extent is there a belief in this country that a diminished US position in the world equals a more just world?
Well, I'll put it differently. It's not necessarily about a diminished U.S. position. I think it's more about the ascendancy of countries within the global south, the ascendancy of particular regions within the global south. The reality is that the United States as a country will remain important, will remain influential for the next decade to come. But the United States has to adjust to a changing international order. It has to adjust to a reality that it is no longer able to dictate how other countries see their interests. And so a multipolar world order, yes, opens up greater agency for countries like South Africa, for regions like Africa. However, it also comes with complications, as we are seeing a crisis in multilateralism. We are seeing deadlocks within the UN Security Council. We are seeing failures to reform institutions like the World Trade Organization, like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. So in as much as it brings opportunities, it also brings about great challenges, which South Africa will require a great amount of, diplomatic skill, but also the ability to build up its own capabilities as a state to be able to navigate this shifting international landscape.
Right. Sherwin, I just want to bring you in. I'm getting some results from my producer, and it is attributed to the Associated Press. And some of the results that are coming in for Donald Trump is over 217,000. For Kamala Harris, it's over 145,000. And there's a third candidate, who's the independent Robert Kennedy, who garnered 2,562. What are you hearing? And where are we? Give us some context in terms of how early these results are.
Let me give you the context. So we told you earlier at around 6 p.m. my time, which is around 1 a.m. South African time, the states of Indiana and Kentucky closed. Those states are going to go into the red column. They're going to go for Trump. We are seeing returns coming in from the smaller rural counties, right? And then in Indiana, the big city in Indiana is a place called Indianapolis, and that'll be one of the larger and last areas to return their ballots, because it's just a matter of mathematics. They have more people living in metropolitan cities, and so it just takes a little bit longer to tabulate those results. We are seeing a sort of a 60-30, sort of 58%, 33% split right now between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, both in Indiana and Kentucky. I imagine that those numbers will continue as the ballots and the majority of those ballots come in, and then they'll probably be called for Donald Trump. But I also want to point out to viewers, Blain, that the state of Georgia, the first swing state, will close in about 11 minutes' time.
Right.
And it'll be soon followed by the state of North Carolina. We also understand that South Carolina will close around the same time. The state of Vermont is the state that the independent Senator Bernie Sanders is from, and the state of Virginia, which is likely to be won by Kamala Harris. But they will close at 7. We'll begin to get some final results from those states and begin to get an indication of how the Electoral College is shaping up. But let me tell you this. Georgia and North Carolina will have the most interest at the early stages of tabulation here tonight. And that's going to give us a very clear indication of where we go tonight. If Donald Trump does not do well in North Carolina and Georgia, that's going to be big trouble for him, because he needs those states to put pressure on Kamala Harris when it comes to the Midwestern states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. If Kamala Harris is able to eke out a victory in Georgia, if she's able to eke out a victory in North Carolina, that puts so much pressure on the Republican nominee to win everything, all the other swing states, which is a very, very high bar here. So we are moments away from those polls closing, and hopefully moments away from results in the near future.
Just help us understand process, Sherwin, and the mail-in ballots and the bulk of them and how they counted. So is it those ballots counted first and then we go into today's voting, or is it vice versa?
So in the 2020 election, all the ballots were counted at the same time. So only once the in-person voting had been completed were all the ballots opened, stacked together, sorted. I mean, it's a process. It's not just a ballot. You have to open an envelope. You have to verify a signature. You then take the ballot out. Everybody's got to compare if it's valid, and then it gets put in the pile. That is then tabulated later. And so what we understand now in some states like Pennsylvania and Arizona, in a place called Maricopa County, which was the big sticking point county in the state of Arizona, which was one of the Donald Trump's cries of election fraud, they were passed legislation that allowed them to start counting mail-in ballots before Election Day. So counting has already started before November 5th in the state of Arizona. The legislation in Pennsylvania, for example, which is also one of those states that takes a lot of time to count all its ballots, they were allowed to start counting the mail-in ballots the minute November polls opened in Pennsylvania today. So at 7 a.m. this morning, when the polls opened in Pennsylvania, it was either 7 or 8 a.m., those mail-in ballots that had been received during early voting were being tabulated from early this morning. So that's a little bit better than what happened 4 years ago when mail-in ballots and in-person ballots were opened at the same time, only when polls closed at 8 p.m. tonight, right, in Pennsylvania 4 years ago. And so there's a little bit of a difference. So we should get results a little bit earlier. You'll recall, Blain, that 4 years ago, the state of Pennsylvania only released a final outcome on the Saturday after the Tuesday election day. So one imagines that it'll be a little bit closer, maybe a day, maybe two. Donald Trump, you heard earlier today when he voted in Florida, complaining that it's going to take more than a day. You know, he wants elections to be declared on the night. It's just not possible in some states. They count the ballots by hand. It just takes a while.
Dr. Mtembo, on that point, after Donald Trump voted, he mentioned that he'd prefer paper ballots and people voting with their IDs and proof of their citizenship, and said, look, if that's the case, they'll get a result by 10 p.m. that night. So he's not a big fan in terms of the technology, but the technology that the U.S. is using, the mail-in system as well, do you think it's something that South Africa needs to look at in terms of our electoral system?
Well, I think our system has been working, I think, quite fine. I think what it might be something to look at in terms of whether it might increase, let's say, the youth vote, because I think a challenge in South Africa, at least a worrying trend, is that some of the younger voters have not been voting. So I think if we can find ways of making it easier for younger voters, sure, then that's something that we need to look at. But the challenge, obviously, with Trump is that I think it's already setting up, certain excuses to challenge whatever result may come. I mean, we saw that in 2020. And although one thing to add is that in terms of the early votes, the Republicans are doing better than they were doing in 2020. So it seems that they have actually tried to get, his base out, including in some of the early votes. But it's something to look at in terms of its utility, in terms of whether it would assist us to actually get younger people to vote.
Sherwin, in terms of
Blain, could I add something?
Go on.
Yeah, so you need an infrastructure for mail-in ballots. And mail-in ballots use the postal service in the United States. That's how you get your mail-in, that's how you receive your mail-in ballot, and you send it back via the postal service. It's a very secure operation in the United States. Can you say the same in South Africa about the postal service? Is it reliable? Is your mail-in ballot going to get lost? Can you assure that it's not going to? So these are the infrastructure questions that South Africa would begin to have to answer before we moved in that direction. Unless you're going to be couriering your ballot back to the post, to the Independent Electoral Commission, and that can cost a lot of money.
Yeah, not at this stage, I would think. Talk to us about, I'm getting more results here. Total popular vote so far. Harris sitting at 37%, just over, and Trump sitting at over 60%. Talk to us, and for our viewers who needs to understand the system in terms of the popular vote and the Electoral College. Talk to us about that fundamental difference and how it relates to Hillary Clinton, how it related to Al Gore.
Yeah. The returns, Blain, that we're seeing right now in places like Indiana and Kentucky is around 11%. So Donald Trump is leading by 60-something%. It's really very much the early iterations of how the night will go, and it's certainly not reflective of where we will end the night. So let me also explain this this notion of a mirage. What happens in various states is the first returns come back from small counties with very tiny populations. They tend to be rural and they tend to be Republican. And so what happens is you seem to tabulate. Republicans take a read. It's a 60-30 split right now. There's a lot of noise in my ear, if we can get that out. And so it creates a mirage. It creates a mirage and a misconception about who's going to win the state.
All right, Sherwin, let me take it back. We'll try to clear up that sound in your ear. We apologize for that. From the conversations you've heard and the early results, give it context for us. Still very early. We've still got a whole gamut of states to go through. Of course, the big swing states, the battlegrounds. But put into context what we're learning at this stage.
Well, I think those are tiny results, and therefore you can't really look at it and perhaps predict that this one has an upper edge. And I think I agree with Sherwin that it's too early. And I think we must have at least these big states declaring, and therefore you can then make a sense of what's happening. I mean, when you look at those two important swing states that are likely going to have an impact in an early stage like North Carolina and Georgia. Right. But for now, this is just a small number of votes that are coming in. And I think you spoke about the popular vote. The popular vote can be a real disappointment. It did happen with Clinton.
All right, let's try to bring in Kate Fisher, live for us in Washington, D.C. Kate, good to have you on the program. You are our eyes and ears on the ground. What are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Hi, I'm here in Washington, D.C. at a Kamala Harris watch party. I'm in a bar, restaurant, bookshop that is queuing out of the door with people coming in here to sit, watch the big screen TVs and the American cable network channels to see how their candidate is doing. The polls have just closed in one of the key swing states of Georgia. And as I've been here, I've been speaking to some of the people here, and I've actually met someone who's come all the way from Georgia. She cast her ballot there, then got on a plane with her family to come here to Washington, D.C. to witness what she hopes will be a moment in history. She is Imani Lewis. Imani, how excited or nervous are you?
A bit of both. I'm super excited to see what's going to happen tonight, but I'm also nervous to see what's going to happen tonight. So a little bit of both.
How important and significant would it be to you for Harris to win?
Being a black woman in America, being an HBCU graduate, this is huge. I've always heard in my life, being a black woman in America, you have to work 10 times as hard to be half as good. So being able to watch a fellow black woman who went to Howard become the president is going to be amazing, which is why I wanted to be here. Being in DC, feeling the energy here, it's great.
And how the polls are so close. Where's your confidence coming from?
Honestly, I am hoping that the rest of America understands that we are making decisions that are going to affect the future of this country. This isn't a small election. This is major. We're talking about someone who's already had, 3 picks in the Supreme Court. We're shaping history, so it's major.
Thank you so much for talking to the SABC, Imani. So Imani's just one, as you can see, of hundreds, I think, of people here tonight, but these polls are so close, and Donald Trump and Kamala Harris really have divided this country in two, and despite the enthusiasm here and the momentum Democrats say they're beginning to feel, they still say they are nauseously optimistic. That is the phrase they're using, because they're just not quite sure if they're going to do it, and they don't want to seem as confident as they did in, say, back in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running and then Donald Trump beat her. They don't want to go through something like that again. So here, amongst the Harris supporters, it's cautious optimism.
Kate Fisher for us live there in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed. We got breaking news on our watch. Just getting this from our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce Peace, informing us that Trump has officially won Kentucky and Harris wins Vermont. What does that mean in the greater scheme of things? We will find out. Sophie Mufkwena, thank you very much indeed. We tried to give you the best possible through the lens of South Africa, of course, and Africa, covering these elections. Morning Live will pick up coverage. You'll be sure to get the very latest and more results flooding in when they come on air at 5 a.m. in a few hours. Thank you very much indeed for staying up with us and for joining us this morning. Coverage continues next. Take care. Bye-bye.